So, some questions for this week's question and answer session. Thanks again for the overall questions, which were quite good. So the first question: why didn't more Democrats in Congress want FDR to expand the size of the Supreme Court? And here, I think there were a number of things that were working together. So the first is, keep in mind 1937. This is still a period where the entire South, the states of the old Confederacy, are a one-party Democratic area where there are some fairly liberal Democrats on matters other than race. There were no liberals on matters of race in Congress in the South. But there are also some very, very conservative Democrats, people who today would be on the extreme right of the political spectrum. But in a one-party area, these people win the Democratic primary and are elected. So, FDR has this group of legislators who are Democrats, but who are somewhat hostile towards his program overall, and are excuse me, are concerned that if court packing goes through, there's a possibility that a much more liberal court will produce rulings that will advance the cause of civil rights. I mean, think sort of this is essentially what the McMahon article talk about. When FDR is able to nominate justices on the court, it does shift the court to the left on civil rights issues. So part of the opposition of Democrats to FDR's court packing plan comes from Southern opponents of civil rights. Then there are people like this guy Burton Wheeler, who I mentioned in the snippet. So Wheeler is one of the 6 or 7 most left-wing members of the Senate in 1937. And what Wheeler is looking at is a concern that FDR seems to be embracing, a kind of authoritarian mindset. So these sort of left-wing Democrats, they're looking at the world, they're seeing Hitler, they're seeing Mussolini, and they're worried that the United States is essentially imitating non-democratic practices elsewhere. I mean, one way you can sort of understand 1930s world history is that, whether it's Stalin or Hitler or Churchill, when Churchill comes to power in 1940, as a general rule, the executive gets more powerful just about everywhere in response to the Depression. And for Wheeler and for people like Wheeler, who are not the majority of Democrats who oppose court packing, but are an important element of the process, their concern is that that this is a plan that goes too far. So basically, what hurts FDR in this area is that he's attacked from both the right and the left flank within his party, albeit for different reasons, and it makes it hard for him to generate consistent support. This is an interesting question, sort of hypothetical. Had FDR's court packing plan gone through and taken effect, what would the constitutional or historical ramifications have been going forward? Would court packing have required a constitutional amendment? And was that the route that FDR's plan was headed, or not? So the latter two questions are the easier questions to answer. It would not have required a constitutional amendment. Could have been done by statute, precisely because Congress, the Constitution doesn't say how many people have to be on the court. This charming-looking individual is Justice Stephen Field, who was added to the court in the Lincoln administration when the membership in the court is expanded from 9 to 10 members, in part because there was a concern that Lincoln's majority on the court wasn't quite firm enough. Think back to the snippets where we looked at the prize cases, that big Civil War case that Lincoln prevailed only by a 5-4 margin. So Justice Field's extension expands the Supreme Court to 10, and then a few years later, when Lincoln is when Lincoln is dead and Johnson is in office, Congress shrinks the Supreme Court membership to 9. So in theory, yeah, FDR could have, the Congress could have passed this by statute. Whether or not the first part of this question, what would have been the constitutional and or historical ramifications? Historically, given that FDR is able to sort of flood the court with members, new appointees after court packing, it probably would have made no difference. I can't think of a single case where the outcome would have been different if court packing had been in existence, simply because the court moves so quickly to the left, as FDR appoints 8 of the 9 justices. Historically, though, I do think that if FDR had succeeded here, we would probably have like a 37-member Supreme Court or something like that. It would have created a precedent for presidents to expand the authority of the size of the court when it served their partisan interests. I mean, if you think of the contemporary environment, there's this current debate over expanding the size of the court, and I think that if it goes through, I would be very, very surprised if it does. But if it goes through, one likely possibility would be, all right, if the Democrats were to add, say, 4 seats to the Supreme Court, bump it up to 13, if and when we ever have unified Republican rule in Washington, they just bump up the court to 19 members or something like that. It's the sort of thing that once the precedent begins, it becomes very difficult to argue a restraining principle when the other party had power. So in this respect, I think you make an argument that probably the system as a whole is lucky that FDR's plan did not succeed. Next question involved the Nye Committee. So mentioned that the Nye Committee concluded the reason for World War I involvement was to benefit war profiteers. My understanding of U.S. history, which is correct here, would make this conclusion unfounded. How did both popular culture, academia, and the committee get it so wrong, or did they? Yes, they did. They did get it wrong. And there are, I think, a couple of things that are working in concert. The first is a U.S. specific thing. This is a photograph of Senator Nye swearing in members of the DuPont family. So this is a major arms manufacturing company, the DuPont company. They also do chemicals. Their DuPont company is still around. It's a big plastics manufacturer based in Delaware. But this is it's the immediate aftermath of the Wall Street crash. Big business, big financiers are almost uniquely unpopular during this period. So the Nye Committee really is of a particular time and place when people like the DuPonts really have no political support. Even conservatives aren't sort of willing to go to bat for them. So to a certain extent, the reason here is that it's the onset of the Depression. The second is that some of the earlier histories of U.S. involvement in World War I, published in the late 20s or early 30s, make the argument that the U.S. involvement was a mistake. If you went to college, rather than in 2021, if you went, say, in 1930, let's say 1931, so 90 years ago, that likely would have been the message that would have been communicated in class, that the involvement simply was not worth it. And that's part of a broader rethinking of the war among some quarters of the academy in the Western world, and in the UK in particular, that argues that this was a war between imperialist powers, that the end of the war, there wasn't anything good that came about as a result of it. So there is this revisionism about entry into the war by the early 1930s, in a sense that the war was fought. And I mean, to some extent, you can understand this. I mean, millions and millions of people die as a result of World War I, and for war aims that are at best opaque. So the Nye Committee is both a product of this broader intellectual and academic revisionism about the war, and a product of this particular time and place where people like the DuPont family are uniquely unpopular in American political culture. And then the last set of questions dealing with the issue of race. So the Dyer Bill was introduced in 1922, almost 100 years later. Why hasn't the anti-lynching bill made it past the Senate? And the second question, Democrats have always been the party that's historically been on the side of segregation. Why the sudden shift in the 30s? Was it merely the narrative look of things that Roosevelt and the party did? On the first question on the Dyer Bill, I remember I talked about in the snippets that the Dyer Bill is blocked because of a filibuster in the late 1930s, and the argument in favor of the Dyer Bill is that even though crime is almost always in the U.S. system a local issue, so it's the, if there's a crime committed in Brooklyn, it's prosecuted by the Kings County District Attorney's Office, not by the Department of Justice. That even though it's normally a local issue in the context of Jim Crow South, white prosecutors, white sheriffs were not going to, they weren't going to arrest and they weren't going to try, whites who had lynched a black man someplace in the South. So absent this federal intervention, these crimes were simply never going to be prosecuted. After 1964, however, a federal anti-lynching bill to a large extent becomes symbolic. First of all, the Civil Rights Act gives to the Department of Justice more authority to sort of bring federal prosecution in this area for crimes that violate the civil rights of African Americans. And secondly, the South simply changes. So the idea that, certainly today, but even in the 1970s or 1980s, if there were lynching in any southern state, the idea that it would simply be not prosecuted. In the aftermath of the Voting Rights Act, even the most segregationist of Southern office holders make minor accommodations to the new order. So there's an anti-lynching bill which is currently before Congress. It passed the House, but not the was never considered by the Senate in the previous session. I suspect it will pass both houses of Congress this time, but in the current environment, it has no effect. I mean, the federal government has already had tools to prosecute lynching since passage of the Civil Rights Act, and there's no indication that state prosecutors are not prosecuting it. On the second question, and the Democrats, this is actually an important question. It's something I should have been clearer about in the lecture snippet. This is a screenshot of the result in the Chicago 1st District. So this is the South Side of Chicago District, which was the first district to elect a black congressman in the 20th century. Republican named Oscar DePriest. This is the performance from the 1934 election when DePriest is unseated by a Democrat named Arthur Mitchell. And you can see how close the result was. So it's 53 to 47. And this is to a certain extent unusual. DePriest is a congressman. He's popular in the region. People know who he is. But it's a margin that also symbolizes that even though black voters flip towards Roosevelt in 1932, there's still a substantial minority of the African American vote that remains loyal to the Republicans in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. So there's no exit polls during this period. It's always tough to make a precise calculation, but the general sense is around 2/3 of the after being an overwhelmingly Republican voting bloc. From 1932 onwards, around 2/3 of the black vote goes to Democratic candidates. And then it's not until 1964 when LBJ, the Democratic president, supports the Civil Rights Act, and the Republican nominee for president, Senator Barry Goldwater, opposes the Civil Rights Act, that the black vote moves to an almost monolithic Democratic support. 90 or 95% of African Americans voting Democratic. So what we're seeing in the 30s is a step towards that transition, but nonetheless only a step, and there remains a substantial minority of African American voters who continue to vote Republican during the 1930s. So that's what we have for the questions for this week. Hope everyone is staying safe and as well, and I will see you all next week. Okay, bye.